The most dangerous moment in any organization is often the moment that everything looks fine. That's usually when people start to relax. Let me ask you something though, and I can't promise you it will be a comfortable question, but if something serious happened in your organization a year from now, would you honestly be able to say that there were no warning signs? Or would you end up discovering that the signals were already there? They just hadn't been acted on. Back in 2005, a refinery in Texas was celebrating record low injury rates. The dashboard looked great, performance looked steady, and on paper, things were improving. But then the plant exploded, and 15 people didn't go home that day. Now, when the investigators went back through it all, they didn't find that there had been a bolt from the blue. They had found there were signals. There were concerns that had been raised, maintenance that had been pushed back, issues that had been known, but they were all competing with other priorities. So the information was always there, it just hadn't been acted on. And that really is the part that should make us pause, because this wasn't reckless leadership. This was experienced people making decisions that felt reasonable at that time. So, what happens then between knowing and acting? Why do smart and capable leaders miss things that later on they just seem so obvious? Well, risk doesn't usually show up dramatically, it drifts. A workaround gets introduced, a fix gets delayed, a pressure point gets managed rather than resolved. Each step feels minor, each decision made on its own actually feels very sensible. And if nothing bad happens, well, that's when our brain quietly starts to react. Because we're wired to look for patterns. If the last 10 months were stable, well, then we assume the next one will be too. And that isn't necessarily complacency, it's just how human brains we conserve some energy. Familiarity, it starts to feel like evidence. And over time, what once felt risky, well, that starts to feel normal. And that's how resilience erodes, not in one big failure, but in these small and accumulated shifts. Now, picture yourself in a quarterly review. Your delivery is on track, margins are holding, there has been no spike in incidents. And then someone mentions a concern. It's not a crisis, it's just a pattern that they've noticed, something that's feeling maybe a little bit stretched. Now, what do you do with that commercially? How do you manage that? Because if we jump on it, if we act on it, well, that might mean some additional cost. It might mean slowing down. It might mean having a difficult conversation with the board. So a common response becomes, well, let's monitor it. Let's gather more data. Let's see if it repeats. And they're not negligent responses. They're responses that we all recognize. They're what we as leaders say every single day. The problem, though, is that risk rarely escalates loudly enough to compete with the performance pressure. Weak signals, they're not shouting, they're murmuring. And it's very easy not to lean into that murmuring. Low incident numbers, yes, they feel reassuring. Green dashboards, well, they feel controlled. But they only tell us what's already happened. They don't actually tell us how close we are to the edge. We could actually have declining injury rates and maybe even a growing fragility at the same time. We can meet every target whilst quietly stretching that system thinner and thinner. And because that stretch is happening so gradually, it doesn't feel urgent until it actually is. Now, inside most organizations, there are really two stories running at the same time. There's the formal story, the reports, the metrics, we've got the board packs. And then there's the lived story. We've got the workarounds and the pressures and those quiet hesitations. On the ground, people are constantly adjusting. They know which process doesn't quite work in reality. They know exactly where those pinch points are. And they know what's being managed. And most of the time, that adaptability, it does keep everything functioning. But it's also that sometimes hides the fragility. And here's the human bit. Raising a concern carries a risk, not a physical risk, but a social risk. Somebody saying to themselves, will I be seen as overreacting? Will this be welcomed? Will this go anywhere? And if the answer feels uncertain, well, silence can actually start to feel safer. And then that silence looks like stability, but it isn't. It's just information that's not traveling anywhere. So let's pause here, because this is often where leaders think, yeah, but we're not really operating at a high level of risk. And that's exactly what every organization has thought before they became a case study. And again, not because they were arrogant, but because internally things felt broadly under control. So let me make this practical. If we took the dashboard out of your next executive meeting, what would still feel comfortable? What would feel uncomfortable? What issue would get airtime? What issue would quietly disappear? And if we're focusing on that, if we're looking at that, that's usually where the weak signals are hiding. Now, a few years ago, I was speaking with a senior operations director after a very, very serious near miss. Now, it didn't become a headline, but it could have. And when they investigated it, when they traced it back, the vulnerability wasn't something that was new. It had been mentioned before, it had appeared in reports, and it had been described as manageable. That word again, that word that keeps coming back and sticking with me. Because manageable doesn't mean safe, it means tolerated. It means we believe we can continue operating alongside this until one day you can't. What stopped that particular situation from becoming far worse wasn't control, it was luck. And luck is not a control measure that we can rely on. Now, organizations respond to what they reward. If the strongest signals in the system are about production and growth and speed and margin, that's where the attention goes. Not because leaders don't care about safety, but because attention is finite. If escalating a concern creates friction, cost, political discomfort, well, then it is very often easier to defer it. And over that time, deferral becomes a habit becomes tolerance, and tolerance shifts the boundary of what feels acceptable. The leaders who avoid being blindsided, well, they're not superhuman, they're just slightly more curious. They don't assume that because they haven't seen a major issue, there isn't one. They assume they might be missing something. And they treat those weak signals, they treat them as if they are commercially important, even when they don't necessarily look urgent. Those leaders will ask, what are we starting to normalize? Where are we relying on luck? If this failed tomorrow, what would we wish we'd taken more seriously? They spend time where the work actually happens. They listen to the people doing the activities, and they listen without defensiveness. They make it feel genuinely safe to raise concerns. But they also understand that drift is natural. But their vigilance, that's very, very intentional. Now, let me bring this back to that opening question. If something serious happened in your organization a year from now, it wouldn't begin with chaos. It would begin, though, with a signal, with a pattern, with a compromise, a concern that at the time felt manageable. And afterwards, someone would say, well, we were aware of whatever that was. The signals are rarely missing, but the real question is whether they move you to take action while you still have choices. Because once those consequences arrive, you don't get those same options. So before your next review meeting, just ask yourself, what are we starting to normalize? Where have we said manageable one too many times? And who else around this table feels safe enough to say something, to tell us something that we might not want to hear today? And that's where leadership shows up. Not in reacting to crisis, but in noticing that drift early enough to change direction.